"You're not good enough to be my wife," my fiancé said in front of his friends. He left me 2 days before the wedding. 5 years later, he opened the door of a boardroom, looked up and saw me standing at the head of the table. I smiled and said, "I'm here to buy your company." The soft clinking of cutlery and muted laughter filled the ambient corner of the bistro as Emma Carter glanced down at her engagement ring for what felt like the 100th time that evening. The small group of friends gathered around the table had been toasting to her upcoming wedding for nearly an hour, and despite her attempts to stay humble, the glow in her cheeks betrayed how proud and content she felt. The wine was flowing, the stories were light, and for a moment everything felt perfectly in place. Andrew Blake sat beside her, handsome and confident as always, holding court with his effortless charm. He was telling one of his signature stories, something about a deal that nearly fell apart, only for him to save it in the final moments with nothing more than wit and timing. Emma knew the story by heart, but she smiled politely, aware that everyone else was thoroughly entertained. Then came a pause. Lena, one of Emma's oldest friends from college, leaned in and said with a grin, "Andrew, you're lucky. Emma's got the patience of a saint, and she actually likes your terrible puns." Everyone laughed, and Emma nudged Andrew playfully. "Don't I deserve some kind of trophy for that?" Andrew leaned back in his chair, glass of Cabernet in hand, and smirked. There was a glint in his eye, one Emma couldn't quite place. "Trophy? You think you're winning something here?" The laughter around the table faded slightly. Emma furrowed her brow, unsure if he was joking. Andrew took a sip of wine, and without lowering his voice said, "Let's be honest. You're not really good enough to be my wife, but I guess we all settle, right?" The table fell silent, the kind of silence that swallows the air and pulls the world inward. Emma's heart skipped a beat as her mind struggled to process what she had just heard. Her stomach twisted, her ears rang, and for a long moment she didn't move. Someone chuckled awkwardly, probably assuming it was some poorly delivered joke, but Andrew didn't laugh. He simply reached for another bite of steak, as if nothing had happened. Emma blinked, her fingers curling slightly over the edge of her napkin. She felt the heat rising up her neck, the way it does when embarrassment meets disbelief. "What did you just say?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Andrew looked at her, then around the table, feigning innocence. "Come on, it's just a joke. Don't be so sensitive." A few others mumbled something, changing the subject, picking up the awkward pieces, but the damage was done. Emma smiled thinly, excused herself, and walked to the restroom with measured steps. She didn't cry. Not yet. She just stood in front of the mirror, staring at her reflection like it might offer some clarity. Her face was still flushed from wine and emotion, her eyes wide with the quiet shock of someone who had been publicly broken. She didn't say much for the rest of the evening. The conversation picked up again, though less naturally. Andrew made no attempt to apologize. He went back to his stories, his jokes, his charisma, untouched by what had happened. 2 days later, he called her from his office. His voice was distant, disinterested. "I've been thinking maybe this wedding's not the right move. You and I want different things. You're sweet, Emma, really, but I just don't think this is it." No explanation, no conversation. Just a decision, presented like a cancelled appointment. She asked once if there was someone else. He didn't answer. Emma stared at her phone long after the call ended. There was no anger in her at that moment, only a numbness that wrapped itself around her ribs. She hadn't cried that night either. Her suitcase sat open in the bedroom. She packed methodically, each item folded like a line she refused to cross again. Within a day, she was gone, quietly, without telling most of their mutual friends. Chicago, once a place filled with laughter and shared dreams, became nothing more than a painful reminder. The streets they used to walk, the cafes they had loved, all turned ghostly and hollow. She couldn't bear to stay. Emma left no notes, no dramatic announcements. She simply disappeared from the city that had witnessed her heartbreak. She deleted his number, blocked his social media, and closed that chapter without ceremony. By the time the news of the cancelled wedding trickled out, she was already halfway across the country. Seattle greeted her with gray skies and cold rain, but it felt honest. There was no pretending here, just the quiet hum of a new city and the soft promise of starting again. Emma didn't know what came next, But she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She would never let that moment define her. Not ever again. Emma stepped off the train at Seattle's King Street station with a single suitcase and a folded copy of her resume tucked into her coat pocket. The damp air clung to her skin as she looked up at the overcast sky, which seemed to echo the heavy quiet that had settled over her since she left Chicago. She had not told anyone where she was going, not even Lena. The idea of explaining what had happened felt exhausting, and Seattle offered anonymity, a blank page. She rented a modest apartment just outside the city's downtown, in a neighborhood with sloped streets and old brick buildings. The view from her window was unimpressive, but it was hers. She filled the space slowly. One potted plant, a kettle, a second-hand desk from a nearby thrift store. She didn't decorate, not really. It wasn't time yet. Everything still felt temporary, as if she might be called back to the life she'd abandoned. Emma applied for jobs with the focus of someone trying to outrun their past. Every day, she revised her cover letters, tailored her portfolio, and researched companies until late into the night. She received more silence than responses, but she pressed on. She refused to ask for favors, refused to scroll through social media to see if Andrew had already replaced her in pictures. That life was over. She needed something new, something that belonged entirely to her. After 3 weeks, she received a call from a boutique branding agency called Blue Peak Collective. The voice on the other end was warm and sharp. The creative director had reviewed her portfolio and wanted to meet. The interview was set for 9 o'clock in the morning on a Thursday, and Emma spent the night before preparing with an intensity that bordered on obsessive. She rehearsed her answers, studied the company's campaigns, even read the founding partner's old blog posts from a decade earlier. The office was modest, but smartly designed. Walls of reclaimed wood, open shelves filled with design books, and a communal work table surrounded by plants. The atmosphere was casual but focused, the kind of place where people cared about ideas more than appearances. Emma stepped into the meeting room in a clean, tailored blazer and steady heels. She felt herself lock into place. The interview started slow, but when she spoke about strategy and user perception, her voice grew stronger. She knew branding. She understood how to build a message that lasted. And more than anything, she needed a reason to believe in herself again. When she left the room, the director walked her to the door and said simply, "You're exactly what we need." Emma started at Blue Peak the following Monday. At first, she kept her head down, working long hours and producing designs with clean precision. She didn't share much with her co-workers, not about Chicago, not about Andrew, not about what she had lost, but she listened. She watched the way the team moved, how they brainstormed and challenged each other. Slowly, she began to offer her voice. Her ideas were thoughtful, often bold, and always well-reasoned. Within a month, her presence was noticeable. Clients requested her directly. Co-workers asked for her input on pitches. The creative director began assigning her more complex accounts. Emma didn't celebrate these victories out loud, but each one chipped away at the invisible weight on her shoulders. She wasn't fully healed. Some nights, she still woke with the echo of Andrew's words playing in her mind, but she was building something again. She also started running. Every morning before work, she jogged through the quiet streets near her apartment. The motion gave her a sense of forward momentum she hadn't felt in months. Her breath, steady and rhythmic, drowned out the noise of what-ifs and could-have-beens. With each step, she felt more grounded, stronger. Seattle's weather matched her mood, gray but full of quiet potential. The city didn't ask her questions, it simply let her be. And in that space, Emma began to notice herself again, not as someone recovering from a broken engagement, but as someone rising on her own terms. Her co-workers began inviting her to lunches, after-work drinks, small weekend events. At first, she declined, unsure if she was ready. Then, one Friday evening, she said yes. They went to a rooftop bar with string lights and mismatched chairs, and someone handed her a glass of rosé. Emma laughed at a joke, really laughed, and for a moment, she didn't feel like someone who had been discarded. She felt real. She went home that night and opened her laptop. She pulled up a blank document and titled it New Venture. It was nothing more than an idea, a spark, a whisper, but it stayed on the screen. She didn't write anything underneath the title. Not yet, but she left the window open as she fell asleep. Emma didn't know when she would be ready to do more, but for the first time in a long time she wasn't afraid of the question. She knew the path forward would not be easy, but she was done measuring herself by someone else's standards. She was not broken. She was rebuilding, piece by piece, brick by brick, and each new day in Seattle was a step toward something bigger, even if she couldn't yet name what that was. The conference center buzzed with an energy Emma hadn't felt in years. She stood near a display booth sipping black coffee from a compostable cup, watching a group of young founders excitedly pitch their ideas to passing investors. The room was filled with ambition, raw, unpolished, hopeful, and something about it stirred a quiet hum inside her chest. She had attended to represent Blue Peak, now one of the most trusted small agencies in Seattle, but her badge only read her name and creative strategist. That title felt accurate, though it didn't tell the full story. Emma had been at the agency for nearly 9 months. In that time, she had transformed from the quiet new hire into one of their most respected minds. Her campaigns were not only visually effective, they told stories that resonated deeply. Clients didn't just like her work, they remembered it. And in the long nights when the office was empty and her computer screen lit the dark room, Emma began to consider something bold, something unspoken. What if she built something of her own? It was a fragile thought. Not because she doubted her talent, but because she remembered how it felt to build a future with someone else and watch it vanish without warning. The fear of failure no longer came from embarrassment. It came from the cost of believing too much in something that could disappear. That morning, she had been invited to speak briefly on a panel about brand storytelling. It was a last-minute addition, a favor to her director who couldn't attend. Emma had stood at the front of the room, her voice steady as she explained how good stories create trust, and how trust becomes loyalty. People had taken notes. They had asked questions. Someone from the back row had even come up afterward to compliment her phrasing. Now, as she wandered the showroom floor, skimming brochures and listening in on conversations, she almost missed the woman who called her name. "Emma Carter?" She turned, surprised to see someone she didn't recognize. The woman was in her 40s, impeccably dressed, with a sharp confidence that wasn't performative. It was practiced. "I'm Sarah Lynn," she said, extending her hand. "I caught your panel earlier. You said something about brands being living organisms, adapting or dying. That was smart." Emma smiled, a little caught off guard. "Thank you. It's something I've been thinking about for a while." Sarah nodded. "I'm an investor. Early-stage companies mostly, but I'm always scouting creative talent. Mind if I buy you a coffee?" They sat at a quiet corner table, tucked between 2 vendor stalls. Sarah asked questions with the precision of someone used to hearing half-truths. Emma didn't bluff. She spoke plainly about her work, her ideas, and how she viewed the industry. She didn't name-drop clients or exaggerate results. She let her thoughts stand for themselves. Halfway through the conversation, Sarah leaned in. "Have you ever considered starting your own firm?" Emma froze only for a moment. "I've thought about it," she admitted, "but thinking is different than doing." Sarah smiled. "Of course it is. That's why so few actually do it. But I've seen enough to know when someone's ready to stop playing support and start leading. You're not a side player. You've got vision, clarity, and grit. That's a rare combination." The words unsettled Emma, not because she disagreed, but because they struck a chord she had kept hidden for too long. Sarah reached into her bag and slid a card across the table. "If you ever want to explore the idea seriously, call me. I don't invest in ideas. I invest in people who are ready to move." Emma left the conference with the card in her pocket and a storm in her mind. The thought of starting something, really starting something, wouldn't leave her alone. That night she sat on the floor of her apartment, the city's rain hitting her windows, and opened her laptop to the file she had once titled New Venture. For the first time, she typed a few words under the title, Strategy, Voice, Growth. She didn't know what the firm would be yet, but she knew what it would not be. Safe, conventional, forgettable. Over the following weeks, Emma began researching quietly. She spent nights reading case studies, understanding business structures, and building a rough framework for what her own company might look like. She reached out to former clients, not pitching, just reconnecting. Some responded warmly. A few asked if she was going out on her own. The idea no longer felt impossible. It felt inevitable. Still, doubt crept in. Some days she questioned whether she had the strength to lead alone. She remembered Andrew's voice, the cold certainty in his tone, the careless way he had dismissed her. But those memories no longer crushed her. They fueled her. One evening, she met Sarah Lynn again for coffee, this time with questions. She asked about funding, equity, team building. Sarah answered without sugarcoating. "This won't be easy," she said. "You will work harder than ever. You will question yourself. But if you're serious, I can help you get started. Think about what you want. Then we move." Emma returned home that night and stared at her reflection. Her eyes were steady, not defiant, just clear. She wasn't looking for revenge or validation. She was looking to create something lasting. The next morning, she resigned from Blue Peak with gratitude and grace. Her director didn't seem surprised. "You were never going to stay small," he said. "Keep us on your future client list." And just like that, she stepped into the unknown. Not with fear, but with a quiet readiness that had been building since the day everything collapsed. Now, something new was beginning. Something entirely hers. Emma had always imagined that starting her own firm would be a liberating experience, filled with creativity, autonomy, and a sense of unshakable purpose. But the first days of entrepreneurship felt more like walking through a fog with a flashlight that barely reached 10 steps ahead. She named the company Ilara Creative, a name she had jotted down years earlier in a notebook during a branding workshop. It meant nothing to anyone else, but to her, it represented a shift, something distant, orbiting quietly, and now finally within reach. The legal paperwork alone was enough to shake her confidence. Articles of incorporation, tax documents, liability clauses. Each form seemed to ask questions she hadn't yet thought to answer. She spent long nights reading online forums, comparing contract templates and watching webinars. Friends who had celebrated her bold move now seemed distant, unsure of how to support her. Emma quickly learned that people admired ambition, but rarely offered help without being asked. The office was nothing more than a converted room in her apartment. She rearranged the furniture, added a second monitor, and hung a whiteboard on the wall where she mapped out timelines and client pipelines. Her only consistent co-worker was the silence interrupted by the hum of her space heater or the occasional call from a vendor. The quiet, once comforting, now pressed on her like weight. Emma's first challenge came quickly. She had been in conversation with a promising client, a local startup looking to rebrand before launching a new app. The CEO had seemed excited, and the emails were warm and full of potential. She pitched a vision, outlined the project scope, and even offered a flexible payment plan. Days passed with no response. Then, suddenly, the deal vanished. No explanation, just a curt message. "We've decided to go in a different direction." The rejection hit harder than she expected. It wasn't the loss of income that stung. It was the implication that maybe she wasn't ready. She replayed the pitch in her mind, wondering if she had said too much or too little, if her proposal lacked polish, if her independence made her seem untested. Still, she pressed forward. She reached out to contacts in Seattle's small business community, attended networking events, and asked former co-workers for introductions. Some responded with genuine enthusiasm. Others ignored her. But Emma kept her focus on the few who saw her potential. Slowly, opportunities began to trickle in. Small businesses needing brand refreshes, a local nonprofit launching a new campaign, a restaurateur looking for help with messaging. The work came in waves, brief surges of activity followed by long stretches of waiting. There were days when she didn't bill a single hour, days when she wondered if the leap had been reckless. But when the projects arrived, she poured herself into them. She offered more than was asked. She revised until it felt right. She turned each interaction into a relationship, and each relationship into a story. Her second major hurdle came in the form of a contract she had overlooked. A client delayed payment for more than 2 months, citing vague concerns about the deliverables, despite having approved them earlier. Emma scoured her files, realizing she hadn't built strong enough clauses to protect herself. No late fees, no defined timelines. She had trusted too easily, assuming goodwill would carry the agreement through. That night she couldn't sleep. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the unpaid invoice replaying in her mind, like a question she didn't know how to answer. By morning, she had revised her contracts, updated her onboarding materials, and rewritten her policies. The mistake had cost her nearly 2 months' worth of revenue, but it wouldn't happen again. Emma began developing new routines. Mornings started with handwritten goals, 3 tasks she had to complete that day no matter what. She checked her accounts weekly, tracked her expenses meticulously, and built an internal guide of lessons learned. She read books on negotiation, design psychology, and sustainable growth. Her world had shifted from reacting to preparing. One evening, a new client, a small but fast-growing wellness brand, sent her a message after reviewing the first round of concepts. "This is exactly what we needed. You brought our story to life better than we could have imagined." Emma stared at the message for a long time. It was a small win, but it felt monumental. Not because of the praise, but because it reminded her why she had chosen this path. Not for accolades, not for control, but to do meaningful work on her own terms. By the 3rd month, she had booked enough clients to feel stable, just enough to cover rent, groceries, and reinvest in her tools. She still worked weekends, answered emails at night, and second-guessed every new proposal. But she was building something tangible, slowly, carefully, but undeniably. Emma didn't tell anyone how much she questioned herself in those early days. She didn't share the panic that surfaced when invoices were late, or the loneliness that followed long hours of quiet labor. She simply kept going. She learned to lead, not with certainty, but with adaptability. She learned that her value wasn't determined by a single failed pitch or a missed payment, but by the sum of her efforts over time. Every stumble became a strategy, every doubt became data, and perhaps most importantly, she began to believe, truly believe, that she could succeed without permission, without apology, without having to prove anything to the man who once said she wasn't good enough. Ilara Creative was still small, just one woman, a laptop, and a vision, but it was growing. And for the first time in a long time, so was she. It was early autumn when Emma arrived at the downtown co-working space where a potential client had arranged their first consultation. The project sounded promising, a mid-size outdoor equipment company planning to expand into lifestyle branding. She had reviewed their existing material the night before, noting their inconsistencies and unclear message. It was the kind of challenge she now welcomed, the kind that invited transformation. The building was glass and steel, polished but not cold. She rode the elevator to the 10th floor, reviewing her notes on her phone until the doors opened into a bright, open workspace filled with plants, low chatter, and minimalist furniture. She was greeted by the client's operations director, a woman named Joy, who ushered her toward a side meeting room with wide windows and a long oak table. As Emma stepped inside, she instinctively paused. Seated at the far end of the room, reviewing a printed packet, was a man she hadn't seen in years. He looked up, and his eyes widened, not in disbelief, but recognition. Daniel Foster, Andrew's former college roommate, one of the last people she would have expected to cross paths with again. "Emma?" he said, standing slowly, brows raised. "Emma Carter?" For a second she didn't speak. Then she smiled, composed and professional. "Daniel, it's been a long time." Joy, unaware of the personal undertone, gestured between them. "You two know each other?" "We were part of the same circle back in Chicago," Daniel replied. His tone was neutral but warm. Emma was always the one who had her act together. That made her smile, though her stomach still tightened with the suddenness of the encounter. The meeting moved forward. They reviewed the brand's current challenges, discussed their goals, and outlined expectations for a potential engagement. Emma switched seamlessly into her role, articulating strategy and narrative with confidence. Daniel said little at first, observing more than contributing, but she could feel his gaze, attentive and curious. After the meeting, Joy excused herself to take a call, leaving Emma and Daniel briefly alone in the room. "I didn't know you were in Seattle," he said, breaking the silence, "let alone running your own firm." "I moved last year," Emma replied. "Things changed." Daniel nodded slowly, as if piecing together a story without asking for the details. "I heard about what happened, eventually, with Andrew." Emma's expression didn't shift. "It was a long time ago. I imagine it didn't feel that way then." She met his eyes, calm and unguarded. "No, but it does now. Daniel seemed to hesitate, then said, "I remember that night, the dinner. I was there." Emma blinked. That detail had been buried, blurred by the chaos of that evening. "I didn't say anything," he continued, "and I've regretted it ever since." She studied him for a moment, not expecting an apology, but recognizing the sincerity behind his words. "I didn't need anyone to defend me," she said. "I just needed to leave." He nodded, accepting that without protest. Before they parted, he added, "You were always more capable than any of us gave you credit for. It's good to see you proving it." Emma walked out of the building with a strange sense of clarity. She hadn't expected closure, but the encounter left a weight slightly lifted, not because of what Daniel had said, but because of how little his presence shook her. The past no longer held the same power. That evening, she received an email from Joy. They wanted to move forward with Elara Creative. The contract was attached. Emma reviewed it, signed, and sent it back within the hour. She didn't mention Daniel in her response, and he never reached out separately. Still, the interaction stayed with her. In the days that followed, Emma found herself thinking not about Andrew, but about how far she had come since walking away from that life. She realized she was no longer running from something. She was moving towards something better. The work on the new project was invigorating. It demanded precision, imagination, and deep listening. She built a strategy that focused on emotional storytelling and practical value, merging the brand's rugged history with a modern voice. Daniel appeared occasionally on calls, offering feedback, but mostly observing. He treated her with quiet respect, never once referencing the past again. Emma didn't overanalyze his presence. Whatever history they shared, it no longer defined the present. She had work to do, a company to grow, and clients who trusted her for what she brought to the table now, not who she had once been. One afternoon, while sketching concept boards at a cafe, she paused and looked around. The city bustled beyond the window, and the sky had broken into a clear stretch of blue. It struck her how strange it was to feel so at peace in a place that had once been unfamiliar. Her life was no longer built on survival. It was being shaped by choice. Emma closed her notebook and leaned back in her chair. The past would always exist, but it no longer had a vote in who she was becoming. And that realization, quiet and unassuming, might have been the most powerful connection of all. The contract came through on a Tuesday afternoon, buried in a digital folder labeled Q4 Partnerships. Emma had been reviewing potential collaboration briefs submitted by a corporate advisory group that occasionally outsourced creative strategy for high-level acquisitions. These projects were rare, but when they came, they brought prestige and visibility. She had worked with them once before and left a strong impression, so when they reached out again, Emma agreed to consult on a batch of early-stage reviews. Each file followed a pattern: company background, key personnel, financial trajectory, branding assessment, market positioning. Emma moved through them methodically, annotating in red, highlighting areas of concern, noting strategic openings. The fifth file stopped her cold. The company name jumped out immediately: Slate Line Technologies. It was not an anonymous startup or distant prospect. Slate Line was Andrew Blake's company, the tech firm he had founded shortly after they got engaged. It had been his passion project, his obsession. The business had grown quickly during its first year, fueled by bold projections and a series of calculated media appearances. Emma hadn't followed it closely since leaving Chicago, but now here it was, not thriving but flailing, and under serious review for a possible acquisition. Her first instinct was disbelief. Her second was curiosity. The file was thick with details: financials showing slowed growth, stalled product rollouts, a dip in user retention. The branding section was weak, scattered across inconsistent campaigns and conflicting public messages. There was no clear narrative, no anchor in the company's identity. That part hit her the hardest. She remembered how Andrew had once dismissed the importance of storytelling, calling it fluff, while focusing entirely on performance metrics. But numbers alone don't build loyalty. That had always been her stance. Emma leaned back in her chair, staring at the screen. The advisory group hadn't mentioned the names of the stakeholders during their initial communication, and no one on the review team had recognized the personal connection. There was no reason they would. She had never spoken of Andrew since arriving in Seattle. That part of her life was sealed in the past. Still, seeing his name again triggered something she hadn't felt in a while. Not pain, not anger, but a strange stillness. The kind that comes when memory knocks but doesn't demand entry. She let herself absorb it, then quietly moved on. She considered declining the project. It would have been easy to cite a conflict or scheduling issue, but she didn't. She had earned her place at this table, and more importantly, this was business. She wouldn't allow one man's shadow to darken the clarity she had fought to build. Over the next few days, Emma worked on the project like she would any other. She dissected Slate Line's user flow, identified misalignments in their visual identity, and compared their positioning to competitors. Her notes were concise, unbiased, and sharp. She proposed a fresh approach, one rooted in simplicity, authenticity, and structure. Each document she submitted was another reminder that her work stood on its own merit. The team responded positively to her assessments. The advisory lead scheduled a preliminary planning session with all consultants involved, outlining the next steps for acquisition consideration. If Slate Line remained on the shortlist, the firms would begin direct discussions with their executive team within weeks. Emma didn't flinch at the news. She marked the date in her calendar and kept moving. A few days later, she received a casual email from Daniel. He had heard that her firm was attached to a major consulting review. "Let me guess," he wrote, "some struggling tech outfit looking for a miracle." Emma smiled at the screen, then replied, "Something like that." She didn't elaborate. There was no need. The weeks passed quickly as the project deepened. Emma coordinated with designers to build conceptual mood boards that could demonstrate Slate Line's missed potential. She crafted a sample campaign flow that centered on clarity, accessibility, and trust, elements their current messaging lacked. She worked long hours, not because of who was behind the company, but because the work demanded precision. The recommendation phase approached, and Emma's firm emerged as a key player. The advisory group noted the strength of her vision, the originality of her strategy, and the professional depth she brought to each review. Eventually, it was announced. Slate Line Technologies had been selected as one of 2 final targets for acquisition negotiations. Emma listened to the announcement in a video call, her expression composed. The names were said aloud. Andrew Blake, Chief Executive Officer. The voice in the back of her mind did not rise. It stayed silent. She did not feel triumph or dread, only readiness. The meeting ended, and she sat in the quiet of her office, the sunlight fading through the window. Her tea had gone cold. She reached for it anyway, holding the mug for warmth, not taste. This moment was not about confrontation. It was not about proving herself. It was about standing in the space she had carved for herself, surrounded by work she respected, supported by a team that trusted her. Slate Line would soon see the face of the firm leading its evaluation. And when they did, she wouldn't need to explain anything. Her presence would be enough. The final preparations for the acquisition review began early on a Monday morning. Emma arrived at the downtown office space Ilara Creative had temporarily leased for the project, carrying a laptop, a thick folder of printouts, and the calm focus of someone who had rehearsed this moment 100 times in her mind. The entire team had spent the weekend tightening their presentation. Everything had to be flawless, clean visuals, concise data, and a strategy that not only addressed Slate Line's current failings, but positioned them for something far beyond recovery. Emma didn't mention Andrew's name in any of the team meetings. Most of her staff didn't know the connection, and she preferred to keep it that way. This wasn't personal for them, and she wouldn't allow it to become personal for her. Her team respected her leadership too much for her to let anything compromise it now. Each slide of the deck was purposeful. The introduction walked through the state of the market. The analysis broke down Slate Line's declining brand equity. The creative section reimagined their messaging through the lens of simplicity and accessibility. It was not about a rebrand for appearance's sake. It was about rebuilding trust. Emma's vision didn't focus on what the company had lost. It centered on what they could still become. On the day of the presentation, Emma dressed in dark navy and soft gray, confident tones without aggression. Her voice, when she rehearsed one final time, was steady. She looked around at the team gathered in the room and nodded. "We've done the work. Let's lead like we own the outcome." The meeting was scheduled for 11 o'clock in the morning in a boardroom on the 15th floor of a corporate tower overlooking Elliott Bay. Emma arrived 15 minutes early, taking her seat at the head of the long glass table. The view beyond the windows was blurred by light mist, the city quiet in its usual mid-morning rhythm. Her team filed in beside her, each person taking their position. Across from them, representatives from the consulting group and several key stakeholders from Slateline entered. She kept her posture neutral, eyes moving across faces until they landed on the one she had not seen in person since the end. Andrew Blake. He walked in with a practiced ease, dressed impeccably, his features exactly as she remembered. Sharp jawline, confident eyes, a hint of self-importance in his stride. But there was something different now. He looked tired, not physically, but beneath the surface, like someone who had weathered storms and was still pretending the wind wasn't howling around him. His eyes landed on Emma, and for a brief second, his expression cracked. He didn't smile. He didn't speak. Just stared, caught off guard by the quiet force of the woman seated at the head of the table. Emma didn't flinch. She didn't blink. "Good morning. Let's begin." The presentation flowed exactly as rehearsed. Emma spoke with clarity and poise, guiding the room through every insight, recommendation, and justification. Her team supported her seamlessly, answering questions with prepared precision. She didn't address Andrew directly unless necessary, and when she did, it was with the same professional detachment she used for every executive in the room. At one point, someone from Slateline's board asked about the company's failure to retain user trust after a buggy product launch. Emma responded with data, narrative theory, and examples from other industries where transparency had turned public perception. Her delivery was neither confrontational nor apologetic. It was definitive. The room listened. No one interrupted. Andrew remained mostly silent, occasionally flipping through pages of the handout, occasionally watching her. If he was unsettled by her presence, he didn't let it show. But Emma could sense the shift. This wasn't the man who had once dismissed her in a crowded restaurant. This wasn't the man who had ended everything with a phone call and a shrug. This was a man realizing that someone he had underestimated had grown beyond recognition. When the presentation ended, the room was quiet for a beat too long. Then came a series of nods, murmured compliments, and a clear statement from the lead consultant. "This strategy presents a compelling path forward. We'll be recommending it for formal consideration." Emma thanked them, packed her notes and stood. She gave Andrew one last glance, brief and unreadable. He didn't speak. Neither did she. Words weren't necessary. Back at the office, the team celebrated quietly, more relieved than jubilant. They had delivered under pressure. The deal was not yet finalized, but the direction was clear. Emma sent a short message to each member of her staff that evening. "You made this possible. Thank you for trusting the vision." Alone in her apartment later that night, she sat by the window and watched the city lights flicker in the distance. The day had unfolded exactly as it needed to, not with dramatic revelations or emotional confrontations, but with quiet power. She had led with focus, clarity, and dignity, and Andrew had seen it. But his recognition no longer mattered. Emma wasn't the same woman who had once waited for his approval, who had once bent herself to fit his version of success. She was building her own version now, and with each step forward, that old version of herself faded a little more. Tomorrow, the next phase of the acquisition would begin. She would lead it the same way she had led everything else, with intention, with resolve, and with the certainty that nothing about her journey had been wasted, not even the parts that broke her. The boardroom was quieter the second time around. No presentation slides, no structured sequence of dialogue, just an elongated oval table, 2 glasses of water, and the low hum of city traffic beyond the windows. Emma had been asked to attend a private discussion with Slateline's executive team, an informal yet strategic follow-up before the next stage of acquisition planning. Her team was not required for this phase. It was a meeting between decision-makers. She arrived on time, seated herself at one end of the room and waited. Her phone was off. Her notes were closed. The room had been cleared of documents by design. This wasn't about data now. This was about intent. The door opened softly. Andrew entered alone. He closed the door behind him, hesitated, then walked the length of the table and sat down across from her. The silence stretched, not uncomfortable, but weighted with years unspoken. Emma kept her posture even, hands resting gently on the table, eyes fixed on him without flinching. He looked at her carefully, like someone reading a sentence twice to be sure of the meaning. "I didn't know it was you," he said finally. "Not until I walked into that first meeting." "I assumed that," Emma replied calmly. He nodded slowly. "And yet here you are. I'm here because your company is underperforming, and mine was brought in to help assess what's worth saving." Her voice was even, professional. She could see the flicker in his eyes, the recognition that the dynamic between them had not only shifted, it had reversed. She was no longer the woman hoping for a place beside him. She was the one holding the pen, deciding how the next chapter might read. He leaned back slightly in his chair. "You've built something impressive." "I have. People speak highly of you. I earn that." Andrew paused, as if waiting for some acknowledgement that never came. "I guess I underestimated you." Emma didn't smile. She didn't soften. "No, you dismissed me. That's different." His jaw tightened barely before he looked away. "You were always smart. I just didn't see where it would take you. You didn't care to look." They sat in silence again. He reached for the glass of water, then set it down untouched. "When I ended things, I thought I was doing us both a favor. I thought I was. Making a hard call." "You weren't," Emma said. "You were avoiding honesty. You were avoiding discomfort. You chose cruelty over clarity." He blinked slowly. "I wasn't ready for someone like you." That part was obvious. There was no bitterness in her tone, only truth. Her words landed without needing to be sharpened. She had nothing to prove anymore. That was the difference. Years ago, she might have trembled through this conversation, might have rehearsed the lines or looked for the perfect retort. But now, she simply spoke. Andrew rested his elbows on the table, his voice lower. "So what happens next? You're recommending a takeover." Emma didn't answer immediately. She folded her hands, considered her response carefully. "We're recommending a solution. One that preserves your product, protects your employees, and restructures your leadership. The board can decide what that looks like, but my team's proposal makes it clear that the current model isn't sustainable." He didn't challenge that. Instead, he leaned forward slightly. "You really don't want anything from me, do you?" She met his gaze, unwavering. "I never did. I wanted partnership. You wanted hierarchy." Andrew sat back, his silence confirming more than his words ever had. He wasn't angry. He wasn't defensive. He was simply beginning to see what he had broken and what he could never rebuild. The room grew quieter. "I think I owe you an apology," he said quietly. "Not for ending things, but for the way I did it, for how I made you feel." Emma considered that. She had once craved those words, replayed them in her head in a dozen different imagined scenarios, but hearing them now did not deliver closure, because she had already given that to herself. "I accepted your absence a long time ago," she said. "Your apology changes nothing, but thank you for saying it." He looked down at the table, then back up at her. "You're not who I expected you to become." Emma stood, gathering her coat and tablet. "You never really saw who I was to begin with." She walked toward the door without haste. Before opening it, she turned slightly. "If you want to keep what's left of your company, listen to the people who haven't stopped believing in it. Let go of whatever pride is keeping you from real change." Andrew didn't respond. He didn't need to. Emma exited the boardroom and stepped into the hall, where the noise of the world resumed around her. Phones rang, elevators dinged. A woman laughed from somewhere down the corridor. Life continued, indifferent to what had just unfolded. Outside, the sky had cleared. The sun pierced through the grey, casting gold across the pavement. Emma stood on the curb, breathing in the cool air, her thoughts quiet. The encounter hadn't shaken her. It hadn't stirred regret. It had confirmed what she had long suspected, that power is not in control, but in peace. That closure isn't something given. It's chosen. She walked back to her office, already thinking about the next meeting on her calendar. The work ahead was challenging, but it belonged entirely to her. And that, more than anything, was what made it worth doing. Emma sat at the far end of the long conference table, her team flanking her in silent readiness. The air in the room was crisp, the windows drawn open to let in natural light, casting soft shadows across the table. This meeting was not about discovery or orientation anymore. It was a negotiation, a high-stakes alignment of power, structure, and forward vision. Slate Line's board members had flown in for this phase. A few of them had already seen her strategy documents. Some had spoken to her during the review phase, but now all eyes would be watching her with a different question in mind. Was she truly the right person to lead this transformation? Andrew entered with two executives in tow, both heads of departments who had been with the company since its early growth. They took their seats across the table without fanfare. Andrew did not look at Emma immediately. He busied himself with documents, nodding briefly as greetings were exchanged. Emma began the meeting without pause. She outlined the proposed structural changes, a full redefinition of leadership roles, reallocation of budgets to core development areas, and a realignment of the brand voice to address the trust gap between product and customer. Her tone was clear, concise, and unmoved by the tension that lingered on the other side of the table. As she spoke, a few members of Slate Line's board leaned forward, asking questions not with challenge, but genuine curiosity. One asked how the proposed new leadership model would impact timelines. Another wanted clarification on how Emma's team planned to retain user engagement during the brand shift. She responded with the same quiet authority that had carried her through every phase of this project. She cited case studies. She broke down transition models. She used data not as a weapon, but as a tool for vision. And throughout it all, she made one thing unmistakably clear. The company's survival depended not on patchwork solutions, but a full structural reset. For a long stretch of the meeting, Andrew said nothing. Then, near the 2-hour mark, he leaned forward and posed a question. Not to his own board, but to Emma. "If this plan goes through," he said slowly, "what happens to the people who have been here since the beginning? What happens to me?" There was no emotion in his voice. It wasn't a plea. It was a question of position. Emma did not look away. "You've built something with potential," she said, "but right now, your presence is tied to the problem, not the solution. Our recommendation maintains the company, preserves the product, and protects your equity. But not your role. It's time for new leadership." The room was quiet. A few glances exchanged across the table. The shift had occurred. Not dramatically, not loudly, but fully. Emma wasn't asking for approval. She was defining terms. Andrew didn't respond. He nodded once, slowly, and sat back in his chair. One of the board members cleared their throat. "And the proposed new leadership, would that be someone from your firm?" Emma shook her head. "No. Our role ends at transition. The company needs leadership from within. New, capable voices already here. My team will help identify and prepare them. But I'm not here to take over. I'm here to help you rebuild." It was the final piece that sealed the room's decision. They broke for deliberation. Emma and her team stepped outside into the corridor, where the silence was briefly replaced with the mundane hum of office movement. Phones rang. Keys clicked. Conversations fluttered behind glass walls. Emma stood near a window, her expression unreadable, hands folded calmly in front of her. When they were called back in, the board chair addressed the room. "We've reviewed the proposal," she said. "There are aspects we'll continue to refine, but the strategy as presented is the clearest path we've seen forward. We're voting in favor of the transition, effective immediately. Executive roles will be reassessed within the month. The transition team will be formed with Alara's guidance." There was a pause, and then the vote was taken. Unanimous. Andrew remained silent through the final formalities. He signed where needed, exchanged a few parting words with his colleagues, and walked out of the room with a posture that suggested resignation more than defeat. Emma didn't watch him leave. She focused on the papers in front of her, signing her final sections and nodding to her team to begin drafting the transition plan. Later that evening, back at the Alara office, the team debriefed around the communal table. There were no celebratory speeches. Only tired smiles, detailed notes, and the familiar satisfaction of work done well. Emma thanked them for their focus, their adaptability, and their unwavering professionalism. She didn't mention Andrew. She didn't need to. In her own office, she sat alone for a while, the city glowing faintly beyond the windows. She thought about how easily power shifts, not with noise, but with presence, not with anger, but with purpose. She hadn't sought revenge. She had sought resolution, And what she had delivered was more than that. She had offered the company a way forward. As she closed her laptop, she felt the weight of the moment settle, not as a burden, but as a kind of closing chapter. The balance had shifted, the narrative had changed, and she had written every word of it herself. The formal decision had been made, the votes cast, and the strategy accepted without contest. Emma thought that might be the end of it, that the matter had shifted fully into execution mode. Yet, late one evening, as she was finalizing implementation timelines, she received an unexpected message from Slate Line's interim coordinator. It was brief, polite, and carefully worded. Andrew had requested a private meeting, off the record, to discuss future alignment and closure. Emma read the message twice before closing her laptop. She considered ignoring it. After everything, what more was there to say? The facts had been laid bare, the choices made, and the future redirected without needing his approval. But something about the timing, the quiet urgency behind a man trying to salvage dignity, made her agree. The meeting was set for the following afternoon. No assistants, no lawyers, just the two of them in a small meeting room on a lower floor of Slate Line's building. Emma arrived first. She didn't bring notes, and she didn't plan what she might say. The room was narrow, with frosted glass walls and two chairs on opposite sides of a round table. There was no view, no skyline, just four walls and a quiet stillness she welcomed. Andrew arrived on time. He looked rested, though the weight of the recent days had etched itself faintly into his features. He took a seat without ceremony, leaning forward slightly as if preparing to make a statement. But when he spoke, his voice was softer than Emma expected. "I've been thinking a lot," he began, "about how all of this happened, about what I lost and what I didn't even see slipping away." Emma waited, unmoved. He hesitated. "You did more than prove me wrong. You reminded everyone who I stopped listening to." "I didn't come here for gratitude," she said evenly. "I know," he replied, "and I'm not offering that as a favor, just recognition. There's a difference." Emma didn't answer right away. The silence between them stretched, not tense but deliberate. She looked at him, not as someone who had once mattered deeply, but as someone who now represented a warning, a boundary she had long since learned to respect. "I built a company with someone else's voice in my head," he said finally. "Yours. Except I tuned it out every time it made me uncomfortable." She watched him, curious now. "You used to say clarity over comfort, that branding isn't decoration, it's structure, direction. I remember that. I just didn't want to hear it from you, and when you left, I didn't replace what you brought, I just filled it with noise." Emma's gaze held firm. "That noise nearly cost you everything." He nodded once. "And your strategy saved it." "No," she said. "My clarity gave your board a choice. They saved it. And only because they were willing to let go of what wasn't working." Andrew leaned back slightly, as if acknowledging something final. "I've stepped down officially. Signed the full transfer this morning." She raised an eyebrow. "You didn't have much of a choice." "I didn't," he agreed, "but I wanted to tell you myself, before it made the rounds." Emma stood, not out of impatience, but as a quiet sign that the conversation had reached its conclusion. "You're not the villain in my story, Andrew. You were just a turning point." He stood too, slowly. "You deserved better from me, in every way." She nodded once, a gesture not of acceptance but acknowledgement. "I gave myself better. That's why I'm here." They didn't shake hands. There were no promises to stay in touch, no forced pleasantries. Emma walked out first, her steps quiet and unhurried. Andrew remained in the room, hands in his pockets, the door slowly swinging shut behind her. Outside, the corridor was brightly lit, a contrast to the room's subdued air. Emma made her way to the elevators and pressed the button, feeling no weight in her chest, no lingering anger, only a crisp sense of finality. Whatever part of her had once waited for a moment like this, for words of remorse or clarity, was gone. She hadn't needed this meeting, but she had chosen it, and that made all the difference. Back at her office, she reviewed the updated contract from Slate Line's board. The transition was moving quickly now. New leadership had been appointed from within, someone junior but deeply respected. Emma had spoken to her briefly, an operations manager named Kira, who had been overlooked until now, sharp, intuitive, with a quiet strength that reminded Emma of her own early days. It felt right to hand over the reins to someone capable of rebuilding from within. Emma finished the last edits on the transition playbook and sent it to the internal team. The message she attached was brief and professional, but it closed with a quiet note of confidence. You have everything you need to succeed. Trust your instincts. Keep it simple. Stay honest. As the office lights dimmed and her team began to head home, Emma stayed behind for a moment alone at her desk. She glanced at the framed quote on the shelf behind her, an old print she'd found in a thrift store months ago. It read, "Build what you cannot find." She had bought it before she'd even known how much those words would matter. Now the meaning was clear. What she had built wasn't just a business. It was a threshold, a redirection, a declaration that she would never again measure her worth by someone else's scale. The day's tension had peaked, but it had not broken her, it had simply passed. The final stage of the acquisition proposal required one last decisive meeting. Though the terms had been drafted and the internal restructuring approved, the board of Slateline had requested a private session with Emma to review a modified recommendation. It wasn't a formality. The board had grown to trust her vision, but they wanted to explore an alternative path, something that would preserve the company's culture while implementing the changes Elara had designed. Emma arrived early, her documents neatly prepared, and her demeanor, as always, composed. The boardroom this time was smaller, more intimate, with leather-bound chairs and warm lighting instead of the vast, glass-walled spaces of prior negotiations. It felt intentional, as if the environment itself was signaling a shift in tone, from strategy to resolution. The lead board member, a seasoned executive named Marla Hampton, greeted Emma with a thoughtful smile. "We've reviewed the structure again," she said, "and we've come to a unanimous interest in keeping the brand intact under new leadership, but with a model that allows for long-term creative direction from your firm." Emma listened carefully. Marla continued, "You've built trust, not only with us but with the employees. And frankly, we're reluctant to let go of your clarity. The original proposal phased out your involvement after transition. We'd like to modify that." The table fell quiet as Marla slid a printed document across the table. It detailed a merger, not an acquisition, not a takeover, but a structural partnership in which Elara would absorb Slateline's branding, marketing, and communications division, operating it independently under its umbrella while allowing the core tech team to remain autonomous. Slateline would keep its name, but the public-facing identity would now reflect Emma's vision. The merger would also come with a stipulation. Andrew would retain an advisory title with no executive authority, no board vote, and no direct reports. A figurehead role at most, one designed to protect legacy value while eliminating any operational influence. Emma read the document slowly. The proposal was bold, more collaborative than she had expected, but it was not charity. It was a strategic response to an internal culture that had been fractured by poor leadership and saved by external clarity. What they were offering her was not just a seat at the table, but a share in the blueprint. One clause stood out. Elara would receive equity, not as an investor but as a stakeholder, with full control of all narrative, positioning, and long-term brand trajectory. It was, in effect, a creative merger rooted in trust. Marla watched her closely. "We've seen what happens when we follow Andrew's version of vision. It nearly cost us the company. Yours rebuilt it. We're ready to follow through." Emma didn't respond immediately. She asked questions about integration, about communication flow, about the responsibilities that would remain under her direction. She spoke not from hesitation, but from the responsibility of someone who understood what leadership required. She had no interest in title without substance. If she accepted, it would be because the offer aligned with her firm's values, not because of history or vindication. The board answered each question transparently. Their tone made clear that this was not a maneuver to hold onto Andrew's influence. It was a practical resolution to preserve what worked while discarding what had not. Emma sat with the proposal overnight. She reviewed the numbers, discussed logistics with her senior strategist, and mapped out the potential growth for Elara if this merger succeeded. It would mean expansion, more staff, and greater operational complexity. But it would also give her access to a broader stage and deeper impact. The next morning she returned to the boardroom, The same group sat waiting, quiet but alert. "I've reviewed the proposal," she said, placing the document gently on the table. "There are details we'll need to refine, particularly in the areas of internal narrative control and transition timelines. But in principle, I'm accepting the merger." A quiet ripple of approval passed through the room. Emma continued, "This is not about rescuing a company. This is about building a new model, one that understands what modern leadership looks like. Inclusion, transparency, creative integrity. That's what Ilara stands for, and that's what we'll bring to Slateline." Marla nodded. "That's exactly what we were hoping to hear." The legal process began that same week. Ilara's legal counsel worked alongside Slateline's internal team to ensure compliance, protect intellectual property, and define every phase of the new arrangement. Emma participated in each step with her usual precision, but with an added sense of authorship. This wasn't just a project anymore. It was a legacy move. News of the merger circulated quickly in the business community. Articles emerged speculating about the reasons behind the restructure, many noting that Andrew Blake had stepped aside. Some mentioned Emma by name, describing her firm as the rising voice in narrative architecture. None mentioned their past. That chapter had become irrelevant to the story now unfolding. Ilara moved into new offices 3 weeks later, twice the size of their old space, with new hires onboarding daily and long-term contracts already in negotiation. Emma didn't expand recklessly. She remained hands-on, guiding each integration conversation with clarity and calm. Her team adjusted quickly, energized by the opportunity and the trust placed in them. One afternoon, while finalizing internal training materials, she received a short message from Marla. "We knew you'd bring strength. We didn't realize how much dignity would come with it." Emma read the message twice, then filed it away without responding. It wasn't about praise. It was about truth. The twist in the offer had not been expected, but it had not been unwelcome. Because Emma had learned through each twist in her story that control was not about rigidity. It was about knowing when to shift direction without losing the core of who you are. And this, more than any role or contract, was what made her leadership real. The move into the new office space happened on a Friday morning. Rain tapped lightly against the windows as Emma walked through the unfinished common area, watching her team settle into their new roles with an energy that felt both ambitious and grounded. The rooms were filled with muted tones and warm light, designed not for show but for clarity, places where people could think, collaborate, and make decisions that mattered. Ilara's transition from boutique agency to creative authority had not been sudden. It had been shaped piece by piece, contract by contract, until this moment where its presence in the industry was no longer emerging but established. The merger with Slateline had brought with it not only influence but responsibility. With the integration complete, Emma now oversaw a cross-functional team whose work extended far beyond design. They shaped how companies told their stories, how they responded to crises, how they built trust in crowded markets. She spent the first weeks post-merger focused on people, quietly identifying the overlooked voices within the Slateline ecosystem. Developers who had never been asked what they thought, customer service leads who knew more about product flaws than anyone in marketing, analysts who had ideas but lacked the permission to speak them aloud. Emma created open forums, one-on-one sessions, and anonymous submissions. She made it clear in both words and action that contribution mattered more than title. Her decisions were met first with curiosity, then respect. Staff who had grown used to performative leadership were now adapting to a culture rooted in transparency. No flashy speeches, no vague visions, just clear goals, honest feedback, and an unwavering focus on impact. Emma promoted 3 internal employees into new leadership roles within the restructured communications division. None of them had previously held senior titles. All of them had quietly built trust among peers through competence and accountability. She didn't announce the changes with grandeur. She let their work speak, as it always had. The brand voice began to shift. Slateline's social channels grew quieter but more intentional. Messaging focused less on performance claims and more on usefulness, responsibility, and the real people behind the code. Their campaigns didn't chase trends, they set tone. Feedback from partners began arriving within weeks. One email from a long-time distributor read simply, "This finally feels like a company that understands who it serves." Another, from a former critic in the tech press, commented on the surprising sincerity behind the brand's new tone. Emma shared these only sparingly. She knew the point wasn't applause, it was alignment. Internally, she introduced a new weekly rhythm. Each Friday, every department submitted a one-page review of what they'd learned, what they'd improved, and where they still had questions. It was a way to keep curiosity alive, to center honesty over perfection. Some reports were concise, others were thoughtful essays, but every single one was read, responded to, and respected. Emma kept her schedule tight but open. Her door, literally and otherwise, remained accessible. She coached rather than commanded, listening more often than she spoke, and when she offered direction, it came with context, not mandates. She wanted her team to understand not only what decisions were made, but why they mattered. With time, the culture transformed. Meetings became shorter but more productive. Deadlines were met with fewer reminders. Collaboration improved across teams that had once operated in silos. And perhaps most importantly, morale rose, not through bonuses or team-building gimmicks, but through clarity and trust. Emma's leadership didn't draw attention to itself. It was steady, it was intentional, and it worked. Meanwhile, Ilara continued to grow. New clients approached with projects grounded in substance. They wanted more than branding. They wanted alignment. They wanted transformation, and they trusted Emma to lead them through it. But she remained selective. She turned down proposals that felt misaligned. She avoided clients who treated narrative as manipulation. She stayed focused on partnerships built on mutual respect. It wasn't about chasing growth. It was about protecting the integrity of what she had built. Late one evening, as the office lights dimmed and the last meetings ended, Emma sat alone in the lounge, reviewing a set of hand-drawn sketches from a junior designer. The ideas were raw, unfinished, but brave. She left a short note in the margin. "Keep going. You're onto something." It was the kind of encouragement she once longed for, but never received. She closed the folder and looked out across the quiet floor. It was no longer a startup. It was a company, not loud, not flashy, but resilient. Emma didn't think often of Andrew anymore, not because she avoided the memory, but because it had simply become irrelevant. Her story had outgrown the chapter where he existed. His name had disappeared from internal discussions. His image faded from articles. He had become what so many eventually become, a catalyst, no longer a character. Now there were new names, new voices, new futures being written. Emma stood and walked to the window. Outside, the rain had stopped and the city lights shimmered softly on the pavement below. There was still much to do, always more to build. But for the first time, she wasn't rushing. She wasn't rebuilding. She was leading forward, not away. A new chapter had begun, and this time it belonged entirely to her. The summit was held at a waterfront venue just outside downtown Seattle. Glass walls overlooked the sound, and the main stage stood against a backdrop of slow-moving waves and distant ships. The event brought together founders, strategists, and thought leaders across industries to discuss transformation, not just in business, but in leadership. Emma had been invited as one of the keynote speakers, and while she accepted without hesitation, she didn't prepare the way others might have expected. She didn't rehearse a speech. She didn't consult a branding consultant. She didn't write down lines to memorize or practice pauses for effect. Instead, she sat in her office one evening and typed a single sentence: "Tell the truth, even if it's quieter than the applause." That would guide everything. On the morning of her address, Emma dressed simply in black and slate gray. Her notes fit on a single folded card, tucked into her blazer pocket. She arrived early, walked the venue quietly, and watched from the back as other speakers took the stage. Some dazzled, some inspired. Others pushed numbers, charts, and projected curves with nervous energy. She waited. She watched. Then she walked up. The room fell quiet as she stood at the center of the stage, without a slideshow behind her or a laser pointer in hand. Just her voice, steady and calm, filling the space. "When people ask me how I built a business," she began, "they expect me to talk about strategies, market trends, or some perfectly timed risk. But none of that is where this started. It started in the quiet moments, moments where I had to decide whether I was going to stay broken or build something from the pieces. The room remained still, listening. I've sat in rooms where I wasn't heard. I've worked for people who use their power as insulation. I've been underestimated, dismissed, and talked over. But every time I was silenced, I took notes. And when I finally stepped out on my own, those notes became the foundation. She moved slowly across the stage, her tone not theatrical, but precise. Leadership is not noise. It's not dominance. It's the quiet, steady repetition of doing the right thing even when no one sees it. It's making space, not taking it. It's listening harder than you speak, and never forgetting that dignity is a strategy. She paused, letting the stillness linger. I wasn't supposed to be here, not according to the people who once claimed to know my limits. But the truth is, no one can measure what they refuse to see. She didn't name Andrew. She didn't mention the cancelled wedding, the public humiliation, or the years of silence that followed. But she didn't need to. Her words carried the shape of her journey without its specifics. And in the audience, a few caught the thread, the quiet undercurrent of a story that had moved far beyond its origin. She ended simply, I don't lead because I need to win. I lead because I know what it's like to have nothing left to prove. That's where real power lives. Applause followed, not explosive but deep and sustained. Emma left the stage without lingering, her posture relaxed. She didn't wait to be congratulated. She stepped down and moved through the corridor toward the lounge, where a few speakers were gathering between sessions. From the edge of the crowd, a familiar presence stood watching. Andrew, not near the front, not looking for attention. He didn't approach her, and she didn't invite him. Their eyes met once, briefly, distantly, and she turned away unbothered. His presence didn't touch her, didn't ripple through her thoughts or unsettle her peace. He was part of a chapter she had already closed. Later that afternoon, as the summit wound down, Emma sat alone on a bench outside the venue, her blazer folded beside her, the sun warming her shoulders. People passed by, talking in clusters, their badges swinging, their hands full of coffee and notebooks. A young woman approached, someone she didn't recognize. "Excuse me," she said, voice uncertain. "Your talk earlier, it meant more than I can explain. I've been stuck, trying to start over after something that nearly undid me. Thank you." Emma smiled, small and sincere. "Start over as many times as you need," she said. "There's no limit to how many new beginnings we're allowed." The woman nodded, then walked away, clutching her notebook a little tighter. Emma remained where she was for a long moment, watching the slow pulse of the world as it moved without urgency. She thought about what it had taken to reach this place, not just the work, but the silence, the solitude, the strength required to rebuild without applause. And she knew without doubt that none of it had been wasted. Everything had led here, the collapse, the distance, the rising, the rebuilding, not for revenge, not for recognition, but for the quiet, steady truth of knowing she had become someone even she had once doubted she could be. She picked up her blazer and stood, her posture light, her expression clear. There were more clients to serve, more stories to shape, more futures to help design. But today she had nothing left to chase. She had arrived.